Hi guys, I'm Danae Brazel and today I'm going to be talking about the brand new film adaptation of Wuthering Heights. Now originally I had no intentions of watching this movie or making a video about it because I really just didn't think I was going to enjoy it. Everything I'd seen and heard about it just wasn't for me, so I really had no intention of doing this. However, some of the discussion around the film did start getting me thinking, and in order to make a video I would then had to go watch the movie, so that is what I did last week. Because I have some interesting thoughts. I definitely have some complicated thoughts around the film. I will start off by saying that I have not read the book Wuthering Heights. If I had been planning in advance to make this video, I would have taken the time to read it. So all of my understanding of the book comes from other videos I have seen, people breaking down that plot and so on, and discussions around why some of the changes harm the story. And I will link any and all videos I've watched about this film or the book down below, just so anything that kind of seeps into my discussion is there for you to look at if you would like. But yeah, I'll get straight into it because the main point I wanted to discuss in regards to this film is no shock to anyone, because I think this is the most talked about issue with the film, is why the absence of racial dynamics harms the story of Wuthering Heights. But I wanted to tackle this a little differently because my main issue and the thing that got me thinking was Emerald Fennell saying that she wanted this film to feel how she felt when she was reading the novel for the first time as a teenager. And so with the casting of Jacob Elordi to be Heathcliff, when Heathcliff is canonically a character of colour, really for me got me thinking about the reader's racial bias as a concept, and I think that this adaptation of Wuthering Heights really brings this idea to fruition. So from my understanding, obviously, the reader's racial bias is a concept that is due to the fact that the majority of readers automatically assume characters in a story are white. When you are reading a book, you automatically assume that everyone is white before they are described otherwise, due to societal norms and obviously whole histories of racial dynamics and what is considered normal. So that is, generally how people read and envision characters, and that alone isn't inherently problematic. However, for many readers, and what this concept really discusses, is a lot of people will even continue to perceive characters as white even once they have been described as having different ethnic features or backgrounds. This is something that has happened on a few occasions with adaptations, where this casting of a white person in place of a character of colour does inherently support kind of the premeditated biases of these readers when they automatically assume the characters are white even when it is otherwise stated. And a really good example of this kind of bias happened with the casting of Rue in the Hunger Games, because many people were mad that a person of colour was cast to play Rue, despite the fact that in the book she is described as having olive-coloured skin. People had an issue with the casting of Rue to be a person of colour, because even though she is described throughout the novel as having olive-coloured skin, they still perceived her to be white due to her being described as similar to Prim, but that was a comparison of disposition and how Katniss viewed her, not as in she is just like Prim, she is white. And this is where I think it became very insidious, especially, was people feeling like Rue could only be as gentle and kind as she is portrayed because they believed her to be white, and if she isn't, that then she's not capable of having those attributes, which is obviously inherently racist. Yeah, so I think casting Heathcliff to be white only furthers this kind of bias of a reader, and certainly brings into question Emerald Fennell's racial bias as a reader of Wuthering Heights. You know, casting Heathcliff this way, making Jacob Elordi play this character that is known to be a man of colour, and it is very important to the plot that he is so, does ultimately just affirm the presence of the reader's racial bias, and specifically that of Emerald Fennell. Now, the other thing I will talk about, even though obviously without having read the book I have less I can say on this than other people, so there are definitely better discussions to be had about this, but Heathcliff no longer being a person of colour in this story also presents serious narrative issues. For instance, Catherine and Heathcliff's class differences in the film do still pose a significant challenge to their relationship. However, the absence of race from this dynamic does place them on slightly more equal footing, even though obviously there is still a wealth disparity. However, this also is kind of changed by the film due to the fact that they're both being raised by Kathy's father, who is squandering all of their money. Therefore, the choices made are harder to justify because there is no racial dynamic that ultimately forces Catherine into the choice to marry Edgar. The point in the book is that the reason she cannot be with Heathcliff is because he is not white. That is the predominant reason for this. So to have completely removed this element makes every choice far more difficult to justify or understand in the film. I also think this change, and the thing that got me pretty immediately watching the film, is that without Heathcliff being a person of colour, it also, I think, changes the dynamic of when Kathy refers to him as her pet, because I do think, while it is still dehumanising either way and quite patronising, calling some kid that your dad's picked up your pet when he is also a person of colour is obviously contributes to the further dehumanisation of people of colour in general. And I think without that part of the dynamic, while it's still obviously patronising, it does lose some of, I think, its context and just makes it come across more strange than actually saying something. The lack of racial dynamics in the film also means that other unfounded reasons have to be used to justify posing Heathcliff as an undesirable choice for Kathy and thus forcing her into marrying Edgar, and so her thought processes are significantly more difficult to understand because we don't really have a complete reason other than wealth, I suppose, but even that I don't think is depicted well enough to support her decision making. The only real reason we are given for Kathy marrying Edgar is that Heathcliff leaves Wuthering Heights because he overhears her talking to Nellie. But it's a very strange having to shift the narrative around in order to make this work, because otherwise there would be no real reason for her to make that choice. Also, another thing that I think made the choice to cast Heathcliff to be white even stranger is casting Edgar to be a man of colour. That, I think, even further complicates the casting of Jacob Elordi as Heathcliff, because that means that now racial dynamics as a whole have to be ignored for the narrative to work, because in the book the whole reason Kathy can't marry Heathcliff is because he isn't white, but now in the film she's going to marry Edgar and he isn't white. So we have to completely ignore racial dynamics for this specific period of history, because if we were to address those beliefs at the time of what would be considered undesirable, Edgar would no longer be a fair choice to Kathy because he is not white. It makes that casting even more confusing to me. I'm so baffled by this choice by Emerald Fennell to not only not make Heathcliff a person of colour anymore, but to then cast Edgar to be so, completely shifting how this part of the narrative works, and then rather than address that fact in any way whatsoever, just completely ignores it and acts like racial dynamics don't exist at all, which is crazy, especially when you consider the period of time this is occurring in. Also, because of the lack of racial dynamics, it makes it very difficult to portray why Heathcliff has his vengeful turn in the latter part of the film and where his anger is. We kind of only see it justified through jealousy and also through the absolute misuse of BDSM to portray a lack of morals or ethics for Heathcliff. In order to demonstrate his turn to anger in the latter stages of the film, he is essentially portrayed as a sexual sadist or a fucking deviant, and he is like hell-bent on enacting cruelty upon whoever necessary as a means of hurting Kathy. And now while that second part of that statement is true in the book as well, like he is doing everything possible to make Catherine's life difficult, make other people's lives difficult because he cannot be with her. However, the choice to make his like dark turn look how it does in the film was crazy to me. To communicate his like anger and jealousy and the way he enacts it through the implication of like rough sex and the use of chains and collars in a sexual context is gross, in my opinion. It leans on the preconceived notions of BDSM to present Heathcliff as violent and aggressive. And I think that is such a strange choice when this also is occurring in a film where Emerald Fennell clearly wants to make like a freaky movie, but then she also misrepresents BDSM in this way and uses it as a trope in order to portray Heathcliff as being bad now. And I cannot understand it. In my opinion, it is an egregious misrepresentation of those who participate in BDSM, as that is like a community of people that are focused on prioritising communication and the establishment of boundaries when participating in these acts, and instead it is used here in order to make Heathcliff into a villain, rather than utilising actual events from the book that are genuinely villainous and unjustified, but he believes them to be because of his love for Catherine. Like having the weird like puppy play shit going on as like Heathcliff is a bad guy now is so crazy to me. It is such, I cannot stress enough, it's such a misuse and misrepresentation of this kind of sexual content. I cannot believe we've allowed this. I think it is absolutely unacceptable to have utilised it to portray Heathcliff as a bad guy. And I also think this goes in tandem with my next point, which is the film's strange glorification of abuse, because obviously like the film is portraying Heathcliff's abuse at the hands of Kathy's father as being bad, but more than that, it glorifies it throughout the entirety of the film, both as like this ultimate romantic sacrifice for Kathy, but also as something that makes him like rugged and sexy, which is so weird. Like, we get several close-up shots of his scars, and they're like, when he's like sweating and like chopping wood or whatever the fuck, and like depicting them as like attractive for some reason, that he has like scars from being slashed across his back, and we're meant to like, I don't know, swoon at that or something. It's so strange to me. And it's like, it's either portrayed that way or it's shown to be like this incredible sacrifice that proves he loves Kathy. And sure, there is some truth in that, but in combination with like trying to almost sexualize the result of that abuse, I think it's a very strange choice to portray it as like this romantic sacrifice. I also think in general the film depicts like a pretty toxic and abusive relationship between Kathy and Heathcliff, but I do think this is pretty true to a lot of the book from my understanding. Like, obviously, like, that everyone is kind of a bad person in this book. That's the one thing with Wuthering Heights, is that everyone kind of sucks. But I do think the film again glorifies their behaviour as being like a result of passion and love and desperation, rather than just actually addressing the fact that like all of the characters are inherently flawed and awful, because so many of their actions are unjustified. They are just making their choices selfishly. But I think the film is so determined to make this a romance, when I don't think it is, that they portray this kind of behaviour from both Heathcliff and Kathy to be romantic and therefore justified, and is like the true manifestation of their like devotion to one another in the context of this being like a doomed love, which I struggle with immensely, and especially watching the film, it lands very strangely to me. I also think in general, without the conflict caused by the presence of racial differences between Kathy and Heathcliff, Wuthering Heights lacks tension more than anything else. The narrative lacks tension. And so in order to make up for this, Emerald Fennell decided to like utilise sexual tension as a way to justify the heightened emotions of the characters in the film. However, this causes the story of Wuthering Heights to lack depth, as it doesn't seem to know what it is critiquing, or if it is even attempting to critique anything at all. I also think this is due in part to Fennell wanting the film to channel how she felt reading the novel as a teenager, because this adaptation really fixates on the exploration of this relationship between Kathy and Heathcliff, and ultimately the film is only concerned with the idea of a doomed romance, but it fails to address how or why it is doomed due to the lack of racial dynamics. Like, that conflict is why the love is doomed, because they live in a period of time where they are not allowed to be together because they are not seen as equals. So without that tension and without that actual conflict, Emerald Fennell decides to replace it with sex, but also in a way that is completely misguided, in my opinion. And therefore I think all the film ends up depicting is a toxic relationship between characters who fail to communicate, which would be fine if only the film wasn't titled Wuthering Heights. I also think this is a problem with also changing the ages of the characters here. Everyone's been aged up, which makes it also harder to understand their choices, because if these were 18-year-olds like in the book, yes, them being endlessly fucking stupid would be justified, but they've been aged up to be in their 20s or 30s, so it's very hard to understand any of the thinking going on. And again, I think the main harm, or the main issue for this film is that it is named Wuthering Heights. If it was named anything else, half of these things wouldn't be problems anymore, because we wouldn't have context of what this is meant to communicate. We would just have a film that would be fine, I think. Now, just to end off this video, I want to just also address some of my more random thoughts about the film that don't really fit into my broader arguments. So, firstly, I will say the cinematography is phenomenal. I think it looks fantastic. It's lit incredibly. I've always believed that Emerald Fennell is a great visual director. I do just think it is the writing of her films that poses a real problem. However, even though I do love the cinematography and the direction, it does feel like some scenes are kind of moving only to reach a specific shot. It's like Emerald Fennell has thought of a shot that would look incredible, and does, but the scene itself has to move to reach it, and I had that on a few occasions. I think it leads to quite a strange pace. Also, several scenes of this movie just give off the vibes of horny TikTok chefs, like, you know, the ones that really aggressively like finger a papaya or whatever the fuck, or like spit on their kitchen counter, like slap like bread dough around. Like, it gave off the vibe that Emerald Fennell's really into those TikToks. That's just a random thought I had watching the movie. I couldn't get out of my head. Like the fingering the egg yolks and the kneading bread, it really just took me right back to when that was trendy a couple of years ago. I also think the film wants to be like sexual and freaky, but it never fully commits to this, which leaves us in a very strange place as an audience. Like, I think if the film was more committed to being freaky and weird, and like more in line with Saltburn in that respect, I think it would be a way more fun movie. I feel like at the very least, if we push that further, then it would be a fun watch rather than just a frustrating one. I also think that becomes very strange when we consider the portrayal of BDSM to be villainous in the film, because it's a film that wants to be freaky, yet it's constantly kind of turning away from that at the same time, which I find to be a very strange choice. I will say, I in general actually really enjoy the unique visual aesthetic of the film. I know it isn't period accurate, and to be honest, I don't care as much because I think it is at the very least very consistent across the film, and I actually do think it communicates several ideas very well. For instance, I think it really works once Kathy marries Edgar and shows her life within the walls of Thrushcross Grange, because it has this kind of hazy, dreamlike quality. It's all very over the top and excessive. I actually think that really works to show the contrast and wealth between Edgar and then obviously Kathy's father, who's still at Wuthering Heights. I think it really easily depicts that, and I think it also, yeah, is a great depiction of Kathy's mind and kind of the haziness of how she's feeling and what she's experiencing. And so along with that, I also actually think that the skin-coloured walls in Kathy's bedroom are a super interesting visual choice, and I actually think it works really well in the story, because for me the first indication that Kathy's health was deteriorating was the fact that her skin no longer matched the colours of the walls. She was now very pale and grey looking in comparison to her natural skin, of which is obviously the colour of the wall. It's like the most immediate sign. You're like, well, something feels off, and it's when you realise, oh, it's the wall. Like, she doesn't match the wall anymore, like she isn't well. And I thought that was actually a really smart way of showing that. I think people have been very harsh about that choice. I get why, because when it's first introduced in the movie, it's very weird, but I actually think it has a great payoff, because it's a really nice piece of visual storytelling of Kathy's deteriorating health, that she no longer matches the walls. And so yeah, that is all of my pretty rambly thoughts about Wuthering Heights. Again, everyone's been talking about this movie, there's been so much said. I don't think much of what I have to say is all that original, but I just had thoughts bouncing around, I needed to get them out. In general, like, I don't think it's the worst movie, but I do have several issues with it. Yeah, obviously as well, there's going to be better commentary from people that have read the book. I have not. If I had planned better, I would have. But yeah, that's kind of all my thoughts. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit the like button. And if you'd like to see more from me, please hit subscribe. Also, first driver ratings of the year will be coming next week, because it is Australian Grand Prix weekend this weekend. I'm filming this on Tuesday the 3rd of March, so I have to have this video out by Sunday. I can't believe it's finally Grand Prix week. I'm so happy. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I already told you what to do. Why am I repeating myself? And if you'd like to see even more from me, you can follow me on Instagram and TikTok. All those things are linked down below. And yeah, that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.